Let's Get Tryin is a podcast that challenges us to live real and authentic lives, no matter the journey we're on, from life to faith to even mental health. Host Aaron Lee presents the importance of never giving up. So let's get Tryin with Aaron Lee.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to this episode of Let's Get Tryin with Aaron Lee. I'm Aaron Lee. Man, if you're watching on YouTube, I'm feeling pretty insecure about my hair today. I don't know why. It just looks weird to me. Anyway, so if you didn't know, we have a YouTube channel. If you go over to YouTube, search Aaron Lee, Let's Get Tryin. You should be able to find us. Subscribe to the podcast through there. You can watch videos, all sorts of fun stuff. We're also doing a segment called Never Give Up. It's going to be a weekly thing that we put out that just kind of talks about some simple stuff in 3 to 5 minutes or so. So check that out. It's a great resource. Also hit the subscribe button for iTunes. Wait a minute, it's not called iTunes anymore. Apple Podcasts, that's it. Google Podcasts, Spotify is another place you can find us. There's all sorts of places that you can find the podcast. So whatever you need, whatever place you need to subscribe, go do that right now. Go do it right now. All right, so in today's episode, if you, wait, let me back up. If you heard in the intro of the podcast, we talk about never giving up. And we do that by living real and being authentic. Now that goes into our everyday lives. It goes into leadership. It goes into the church, goes into mental health. And in this episode, I'm going to share a conversation that my friend J.R. Horn and I had on his podcast, the Seats to Streets podcast. It's an awesome podcast where he's challenging church leaders on new ways to get their people out of the seat and out into the street to share the gospel, to mobilize them. But in this episode, we talk particularly about how mental health has affected the church, how it affects church leaders, and how COVID was a big part of that. So that's what this episode's all about. It's a great conversation that he and I had, and I believe it needs to take place no matter what, whether you're in the church or you're not in the church. This conversation is something that needs to be had because people are struggling. They're still struggling. Just because things are getting a little more normal doesn't mean that it's still not hard for some people. So with that being said, let's jump over to this conversation I had with my buddy JR.
Hey, and welcome to the Seats to Streets podcast, a conversation centered around adding a voice and practical tools through your earbuds on the subject of missions in the established church. Many pastors and pastoral staff want to do more in the area of local and global missions, but feel overwhelmed at where to start and how. Listen in and learn key practices and new perspectives from missionaries and ministers working to move people from Sunday morning seats to local and global streets.
Hey, welcome to today's episode of the Seats to Streets podcast. I'm your host, J.R. Horn, and with me today is a close friend of mine, a friend that we went to college with, and I want to bring up a conversation that needs to be had in the church. We're going to talk today about mental health, especially maybe coming out, or in the midst of COVID and the resurgence of people coming back to church and being active again in our faith. What does that look like? How has COVID affected our congregation? How has it affected our pastoral staff and what we do as a church? So with me today, I have Aaron Lee from the Let's Get Tryin podcast. And the Let's Get Tryin podcast is a podcast that challenges us to live real and authentic lives, no matter the journey we're on. Now, I don't want to take all the thunder away from Aaron, and I really want him to explain a little bit more about this idea of mental health in the pastorate and what that looks like. So, Aaron, how you doing, buddy?
I'm good, man. Thanks for letting me be a part of the podcast. I'm thrilled. It's been cool to reconnect with you, man, since college and all that. So, yeah. So Let's Get Tryin podcast. That's a podcast that I've been running for about 2 years now, and started out actually was called The Anxious Pastor because I'm a anxious pastor. And, not very deep thinking there. But, one of the things I realized and the reason it's Let's Get Tryin was it was so important for me to understand that mental health requires us to get up every day and keep going and keep trying. And that's not just mental health, but just in our spiritual walks. And so a big part of this podcast has been to help people that are struggling day in and day out, feeling like, man, I have to hide what I'm struggling with. I have to hide this mental illness, this feeling that I have that's kind of taboo in our world today.
Right.
And so what I've tried to do is create a safe place where we can talk about vulnerable things and just encourage people to keep living in that. So that's what Let's Get Tryin's all about.
Man, I appreciate the authenticity that you bring to that, to say, hey, we need to have a conversation with it. And soon you're going to share a bit about your story of how that was real for you and that led to this idea of giving back to those who need to have someone maybe speak up on their behalf and to tell them that it's okay to open their mouth and to say, hey, I need help in this area. One of the things that we've talked about before that circled the globe is as far as in church world and even out of church world is the need to take care of our bodies. And so there's been a series on taking care of ourself, taking care of what God has given us. And a lot of times that goes toward the physical aspect of that conversation, but we kind of shied away from the other areas of health that we need, the emotional side of health, our mental side of health. It's even interesting now, Aaron, you've probably seen it coming out, that there has been studies on the difference between IQ and EQ. Right? Your intelligence quotient and your emotional quotient, this idea of how emotionally healthy are you and as a workplace and as somebody who's on staff and things like that. But I really wanted to have that conversation with you because you are a pastor. You are someone who is a voice for those that feel like they have no voice when it comes to mental health. And we're seeing that become a topic in our churches and in our circles. So give me a little bit of background of your walk with coming to this, I guess you could say, a better place of health when it comes to your mental health and emotional health journey.
Yeah. I appreciate that because there's so much of this stuff was where we have to kind of look at our own journeys and see why we got or how we got here. And that's a big deal to me, is understanding what has caused some of these issues in your life. And so I'll jump back just real briefly and kind of give you a little bit of context for what I'm going to share. So I, as a kid, elementary school, was bullied quite a bit. Dealt with lots of just not feeling like I fit in. And in different ways, the church actually was the place that I did feel like I fit in. So that was a really great piece for me. One of the things I've told people many times, I don't know where I would be if I hadn't felt accepted in the church.
Wow.
And I had a youth pastor who really loved on me and didn't care about all the things I thought about myself. He loved me anyway. And I think that was so critical. But the problem was because of what I dealt with as a child, it created some lies that the enemy has just rooted in my mind. And then as I got older, I started to feel that more and more and more. And then the problem came, I would start to self-medicate myself through it. And I want us to all see that there's a tie between the ways that we respond to our anxiety and our depression. We want to be medicated. We want to feel better. And right. I think that's a huge piece in this that we sometimes avoid. And I will say that for me personally, I dealt with a 13-year pornography addiction. And that was the result of, through counseling, I figured out that was the result of me just wanting to feel accepted and feel needed and feel wanted. And it was just this crazy thing for me to realize that, I always thought, well, the pornography was the problem, but the problem was more in how I thought about myself and then how I was responding to what I thought about myself. I wanted to feel better. I wanted some way to feel accepted. Well, you fast forward through that. I'm luckily going on 10 plus years in recovery of that. So I'm very thankful for what God has done in my life and through that. But I will say that it has also brought up some other things that, as I'm still working through my own insecurities and my own struggles, my mental health had gotten worse. And so what I found was, through those thoughts, then I started to find myself in depression, and then really deep, dark places that would just not a place I would want anybody to live. And then anxiety would cause that depression, or that depression would cause anxiety, where I just felt so overwhelmed. And I even to this day, I battle social anxiety, which is ironic to what I do for a living.
Right.
I lead worship at a church, and I have to stand in front of people, and I have social anxiety. But what I've learned is that it's okay to admit that what you struggle with. And that's what started to happen more and more in my life. As I was struggling with it, I was just asking more and more people for help. And as I started to ask more and more people for help, then more and more people started to say to me, man, I'm so glad you said that, because I'm struggling too. And I just always thought it was me,
right,
who was by myself. And that plays a huge part in whatever the enemy's trying to do in our lives, and tell us, no, you know what? You are alone. Nobody cares about you. And so don't share that, because they'll judge you for it. And that has changed my whole world and my whole understanding of how mental health is affecting us today, because what the enemy wants is for you to hide in it.
Right.
And that's a very dangerous place to be.
So as a pastor, with knowing that the majority of our listeners are pastoral staff and or missions team leaders or missions team members, as a pastor, how hard was it to come out and say, I am needing to focus on my mental health? Like, were there times where you got like odd looks or pushback by just coming out and saying, I need to focus on my mental health here?
Yeah, I would say there was, especially early on when I started, I guess you could say, testing the waters
Right.
of what I could share in my mental health. I remember I got kind of emotional one Sunday, just feeling, I was very anxious that morning, and I had gotten on stage. I had kind of broke down a little bit in one of the songs because I was overwhelmed, not in a good way. I was like in a really dark place. And I remember, and I'm not going to bring up anybody's name, but I remember a specific pastor saying to me, hey man, you need to kind of tone that back a little bit. And he kind of reprimanded me for feeling what I felt and being broken, even, from the platform. And I remember, though, on the same day, someone coming up to me, and this has happened so many times, coming up to me and saying the exact words like, me too. I am in the exact same spot as you today. I did not want to be at church. I was terrified to even walk in the doors, and to know that someone on stage was struggling actually connected with me, because I always thought you guys had it together. I thought you guys were perfect.
Well, there is that stigma. I mean,
yeah,
you've seen it firsthand. So I would love to know what you think about why you were given that response. I have an idea that some of those responses, when we get close and personal with someone who is struggling with their mental health or actively seeking to improve it, I'm wondering if some of those responses of either looking the other way or not responding, or responding in that manner of, hey, let's tone this down, is actually a response of fear and unknown. I don't know how to help you in this moment, and I'm fearful that this may cause a problem, whatever that concern, problem, or hypothetical problem could have been. So let's just tone this down. How much of unawareness and potential ignorancy of our mental health plays into the fact of how people that are struggling with their mental health or looking to improve it, how does that affect them when they bump into those barriers?
Yeah, I think it affects those of us, I'll tell you, made me skittish to even think about sharing things in the future. And a lot of that came from, as you're hearing those things, you're thinking, okay, am I doing something wrong?
Right.
And then you start to believe, okay, and I will say this, I'm not a believer that you just need to have more faith. I really believe that, like, I do have a lot of faith in the Lord, but it's not so much that the Lord will heal me. I do believe he can, but I think what was happening to me was I was getting some lies of who God was. And it was like, well, God doesn't want you to share that. That's the kind of things I started thinking about myself. Those are the kind of things I started thinking about what he was, what they were saying to me. And I wrestled with that because I felt like I was a bad pastor, a bad minister, a bad communicator. And it pushed me away from it for a little bit. But then I'll say, the more the Holy Spirit worked in my life, the more I realized, no, that's not what I'm being called to do. So, it made me more timid. It brought the fear back into it. And that's something that's the key word right there that will control us all in this whole thing.
Right.
Is fear. And I think that was a really hard piece for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's damaging when we bump into some of those moments where someone didn't intend for the message to come across that way.
Right.
But that's how it was communicated, right? So you determined, because of the words out of that individual's mouth, you determined that the communication was, stop making this up. Let's get back to our job. I mean, was that too far of a...
No, exactly. It kind of seemed like I wasn't being genuine.
Right.
But I was being genuine, but it maybe because it felt taboo, or maybe like you said, it was like, how do we actually navigate through these waters? Because we've never done it before, we don't really know how to manage that. So let's not talk about it, or let's not do it.
Exactly. Let's just look away and pretend that it's not going to be there.
Right.
So we're in the midst of COVID. We're seeing, this is springtime here. This is about the end of April, recording this podcast, and we're starting to see a lot more warmer weather, people being outside, which is normally a better time for mental health, right? You get things like the winter blues, which are absolutely real.
Right.
So coming into a time where we're going to be outside, where we're going to be able to be around more people, and especially with COVID, that has driven people so far in. Aaron, as a pastor, what have you seen from congregations in general as to far as the mental health of the congregation now in the midst of COVID?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think there's something that's happening that we've never seen before in a lot of people's lives. They are experiencing anxiety and depression for the first time, and they don't know what it is. Okay, so I remember thinking about that. Okay, so almost for some of us who have dealt with this for a while, we actually came into COVID in a better place than the people who had never experienced it before.
That makes sense, yeah.
Yeah. So, like, I kind of knew the things that would help me through it, get me through it. And it didn't mean I didn't struggle, but it did mean that then for those people who weren't, and that's the thing I'm seeing, and especially in more people like our age. I've also talked to some families. You get into the side of it, like the health crisis side of, experiencing people you love and care for dying. And that's created anxiety, absolutely, rightfully so. But then there's the people who are just like, okay, my world's been shattered. Things are not the way they used to be. And then we came out of quarantine thinking everything was going to go back to normal, and it didn't. And so what I'm seeing is people relapsing back into, that feeling like they're being drowned in anxiety and depression. And then I'm seeing people who are really experiencing it for the first time, and they have no clue what they're experiencing. And because of that, they don't know how to ask for help. And that's a critical piece to all of this, because I think for all of us, we know that this is probably a once in a lifetime, hopefully,
Right.
thing that happens. And when you get shook that much, something's going to happen.
You mentioned an interesting phrase of not knowing how to ask for help.
Mm-hmm.
That's huge. That's massive. I mean, not just knowing who is different.
Right.
Not knowing who to talk to means you've already have an understanding of what you should talk about and how you need to go about it.
Right.
But the fact that you don't even know how to ask for help, like I don't even know how to help you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Was some of that words you got from that pastor while you were on stage. That is a big deal. So what do we need to do as pastors? What do we need to do to help our congregation know how to speak up and to have some of the verbiage to describe some of their needs?
First and foremost, you have to tell them it's okay. I am like incredibly humbled by the church I get to be a part of that says, you know what? We recognize that you're struggling and that's okay. Now, you may not be able to pinpoint what it is you're struggling specifically with, but know that whatever it is you're feeling, it's okay to feel that way. It doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you a terrible Christian. It's just something you're dealing with. It's just like the physical elements in your body. You stub your toe, it hurts. Mentally, there's things going on in our heads. Physically, there's something going on in our heads that is causing us these issues. Now, I think there is a huge spiritual aspect to it as well, but that doesn't mean that you should be afraid to struggle. That's, Paul talks about suffering all the time, and that's okay. The other thing I think that's important to tell people is talk to someone. You don't have to know all the pieces, but to be able to say, the church is actually people that care about your life. Mm-hmm. So go talk to someone because they care about you.
Right.
And that's yet again another lie that Satan wants to tell us, is that one, that the church will judge us, and two, that no one wants to hear our problems because they've got their own problems. Mm-hmm. No, like that's how we work through this stuff together. Right. Is by leaning into those things. So I definitely think giving them permission to struggle and saying, find community, find someone that can walk with you when you're struggling. Those are huge pieces. Then I would say from a leadership standpoint, acknowledging that there are both physical and spiritual sides to this topic. Mm-hmm. Let's call it what it is and not try to white knuckle our way through, just pray more, because I absolutely, don't get me wrong, prayer is huge 100%. In this. But if you need help from a physical standpoint, embrace that, allow people to help you with that. And I mean, me personally, I remember several years ago, I had an all-out, woke up in the middle of the night, had what I felt like was a heart attack. And my wife throws me in the car. We go to the ER. Literally, I was having a panic attack. That was the first panic attack I've had in my entire life. But in what I thought was a heart attack was actually just my body telling me something's not right. Right. So, and a lot of it had to do with some stress that I had on me and different things. And so then I had to start talking to people about that. What's overwhelming me right now? Right. What are the pieces that are hurting me? So I think the more that we can help people kind of dissect what it is that's going on in their lives, and then also give them permission, that's going to be critical.
Yeah, you talked about panic attack, and maybe it's out of some ignorancy, right? I would maybe self-label myself a not as anxious person, right? Maybe sure. Maybe you and I could work on that later. But I remember one specific time back in college, back at Kentucky Christian University, there was a time where I felt that. I felt this just as if my heart just stopped and then restarted several times. I remember it vividly. We're sitting in the cafeteria. It's senior year. It's actually spring semester of senior year. Graduation is right around the corner. Heather and I were engaged, and we're graduating, getting married, and hopefully going to our first ministry all within the next 3 months.
Sure.
And I am still in the application phase, still in the interview phase with churches. And I remember in the cafeteria, the same day that I got information back from 5 churches that had moved on to other candidates, which means thanks but no thanks. We're not interested anymore. All 5 were the only 5 I was in conversation with. All 5 pulled out on the same day. And I remember standing up from the cafeteria table. I just got the last email, right? That just got the last email. It was on my Palm Pilot because I had a hand-me-down.
I was trying to remember what we had then.
I had a hand-me-down like Windows Palm Pilot that worked half the time, right?
Nice.
It didn't even have a smartphone. I didn't even understand what texting was until later. So I'm reading this last email because they've all just come in. It's now supper time. So all 5 have communicated that in the 8 business hours of the day.
Sure.
And I remember feeling like my heart stopped, and I sprang up from my seat. I went out the emergency exit, out into the field, because I'm like, if I'm going to die, I don't want to die with all these people looking at me. I'll go outside and try to get to a hospital or something.
Right.
Heather's sprinting after me, and she's like, "What is going on?" I was like, "I think I'm dying," because I had no words. I didn't have any words then to express what that was. Now I understand it's a panic attack. Now I understand that there are precursors and that there are other feelings that come along before that, so that I can smell the fire burning and not feel the heat to know that a fire is burning. So
yes,
man, you want to talk about the reality of that is 100% true. So that brings me to an idea, Aaron, and I hope I'm not asking like a super rudimentary question, but I want to ask very low-level questions so that pastors and churches can understand what this looks like. If you had to tell me what poor mental health looked like, how would you answer that?
I'm probably going to go out on a limb with this. It's actually not a rudimentary question. I think it's probably one of the deepest questions you can ask, because we all put on a mask. We all put on a facade, right? Mm-hmm. So that whole, if you don't give them permission to struggle, then they're just going to hide it, right? So here's my theory. I'm no expert at all this, but I will say, I think insecurity, I know this is a really odd thing, but insecurity drives a tremendous amount of our mental struggles. Mm-hmm. And why I'm saying that is analysis of my own life and then just observing other people. Most of the time when we start to allow that stuff to creep in, it's because of something we believe about ourselves and haven't really addressed. Okay. So when you go into counseling, they always talk about the mommy daddy issues, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. When you start dissecting that, you could have had great parents, but we live in a broken world. So at some point your parents didn't do something that you needed. Mm-hmm. And that's just reality. Somewhere in there, the enemy created a little fib about yourself and you start believing it. And then it breeds into more and more things. And then you start believing those lies. And when you believe those lies, you start to you start to deal with it in different ways. Okay. So the insecurity thing is a big piece of it. I would say also, if you're looking out into your congregation and when you talk about this stuff, I mean, it's just like anything. When you talk about this stuff, if there's people who get up and leave, or there's people who are in tears, or there's people shaking their heads, that should communicate to you that what you're saying is resonating. I know the people walking out thing is weird, but let's be real. When people get uncomfortable, they bolt. And that's it's the fight or flight piece that's built into us for survival. So a lot of times people will argue that this is not a thing, or they'll say, I'm just going to avoid that conversation. I don't struggle like that. I don't have these issues. Mm-hmm. We all have them in maybe a minor way or a big way or whatever. I think the more that we can have conversations to allow people to talk about what they're feeling and it be safe, even if they don't fully agree with it, they'll work themselves through it, with people from the church that can, guide them and love on them and all that. I just think the more that we can recognize that, just walk into a room and say, at least a portion of the people that I'm ministering to is dealing with this. Mm-hmm. The odds, I don't know the statistics right off, but the odds that there are people dealing with it, I actually did hear this one yesterday that it is believed that between 1 and 3 people that you interact with are dealing with a mental health issue. Maybe aware or not aware. So you have to walk into your church on Sunday, walk in to your small group, whatever it is, how you're interacting with them, and assume that someone in that room is struggling. And so then you can start getting into, if you have relational equity with these people, then you can start helping them unpack some of the things that are driving these insecurities, some things that are driving these feelings of brokenness. And it's not going to always fix the mental piece, but it goes a long way.
Right.
It goes a long way.
So let's put our pastor hat back on. Now, if there's, knowing that we have a large amount of pastors that listen to the Seats to Streets podcast, and we want to equip them with the tools to ensure they are mobilizing their people from Sunday morning seats to local and global streets. Yep. One of the things we want to do is send out emotionally healthy and mentally healthy disciples who make disciples. So now we have a pastor that's listening and he recognizes that there's a few individuals that have poor mental health. How does that pastor recognize more of the individuals around him? Like you said, the people that get up and bolt, you got some, those are people that are, I don't want to say easier to recognize, or people that would come up to you and say, hey, I need help in this. Yeah, that's easier to recognize your area of assistance that's needed. But how does a pastor recognize individuals that are poor in mental health? And then what can they do to help them progress to a more healthier place?
The first thing I can tell you, and this is just from my own experience, again, I don't know all the answers, but as much as you can be vulnerable and share your own struggles or struggles of people in your congregation, the more you're going to open that door for those people who are afraid to talk about it. Literally, the more you talk about it, the more you're giving them permission to talk about it. So I think you're going to start breaking down barriers. You're going to have the people who will jump on it without you even saying a word, and then you're going to have the people who will never talk about it. But then there's that group in the middle that I believe that the more they hear stories of people who are wrestling with the same thing as them, then they're going to feel more and more accepted in being able to share that. So I think that will help because I'm telling you, like one specific, it's literally kind of like the first one I shared. I had one Sunday morning, not too long ago, actually, probably right before COVID. I felt like I was having an anxiety attack, and I could not even sit with our worship team before we went out. I was like so overwhelmed. I had to go sit like in a hallway and kind of control my breathing. And I remember getting on stage and saying, hey, before we sing any songs, I just want to tell you all where I'm at and ask for you to pray for me in this moment. Mm-hmm. I know that's weird, like especially as a pastor, you don't feel like you're supposed to do that. Man, I can't even count how many people came up and said to me, people I never even spoke to before, said to me, thank you, because I'm right there. It's just the reality is they believe they can't talk about it. So the more you can show that from the stage or show that from your relationship with them, the more they're going to open up.
Right.
I would say the next part of your question about how do we help them move on from there is, we got to have resources available to those people. I will say more than ever, you need, and I know this isn't easy for every church, but I do believe you need a staff care piece to your church. And that's taking care of the staff you have mentally and spiritually. But then those people can be trained to help walk those people along. So that may be pulling in a counselor from a local counseling service to come and equip your staff to help out with that. I think it's also providing those resources to your congregation, saying, hey, in our area, there's these 5-6 Christian counselors that you can connect with. And if you have the resources, man, say, hey, we'll pay for your first session with them if you'll go talk some of these things out. Then also, putting together we have different ministries at our church. We have anxiety groups where they'll come together and they talk about how their anxiety is affecting them that week. We have depression groups. We have all sorts of different groups that meet on a weekly basis to, one, be vulnerable with one another and also be there for one another when they're not meeting. And I think those pieces will help move those in the right direction. And then, you're kind of doing it the way Jesus calls us to be disciples to one another. You don't have to be an expert to do this. It's really just walking with people and helping them figure out what their next step is.
So, Aaron, you brought up this idea of counseling and going to counseling. You've even shared your experience of going to counseling and the positives that has brought into your life. Right. I was the type of guy that was brought up that like, you don't need counseling. You just man up and deal with it. Right.
Yes.
I mean, that's very prevalent in the churches. It's very prevalent in some dads' strategy for raising their children. We just, it's different than just rub a little dirt on it. It'll be okay. Right. This subject, this conversation of mental health and emotional health we can't use the phrase rub a little dirt on it. It'll be okay.
Yeah.
That's what's got us to this conversation. And I always would push back on counseling until I realized that everyone needs counseling.
Yes.
I mean, everyone, including myself. I mean, think about it. If you've ever gone to your quote unquote best friend and said, I just need you to listen for a moment, and you just, whatever it was, maybe it was problems with your spouse, maybe it was problems at the church, somebody did this, or they blah blah blah, or whatever, that's a counseling session. I mean, that is you're trusting someone with information, and you are trusting that they will give you quality feedback, right? And if that person does say just rub a little dirt on it, you need to find better friends, right? Sometimes that answer is okay, but not when it comes to our anxiety, not when it comes to our mental health and our emotional health. So, Aaron, as a pastor, let's speak to pastors for a minute. What do pastors need to do if they start recognizing some of their own areas where they say, hey, I don't think I'm in the greatest of mental health areas, right? We've been trained to look at our spiritual health. We've been trained to keep an eye on that. The idea of physical health is becoming more and more of a talked about thing in church. But let's say we have pastors that are listening to the podcast and they say, I think I may have some of those things that Aaron was talking about. What are some ways that pastors can recognize their level of spiritual health or their level of mental health, and what can they do to bring that to a healthier plane?
Yeah, so I would say there's different pieces to this. One being, say you're an anxious, or you're seeing anxiety starting to pop up in your life, or something or starting to feel more and more uncomfortable on a regular basis about, everyday things. That's a good indicator that maybe there's something going on mentally. I would also say that even with that there's a theory out there that anxiety is actually a habit. It's something that you've created and you continue to do. And so they say within habits, there's triggers, there's the things that trigger you, there's the things that will come out of you being triggered. So you may have anxiety, and from that anxiety you worry. And from that worry, then you are anxious again, or you then self-medicate or whatever. There's a result. So there's a trigger, there's the things that come out of it, and then there's the result. And in that, you can start to see a pattern in your life. Like, okay, this is becoming a problem. And so I think you can recognize things a little better when you see that there's a pattern or a habit starting in your life. That's been a real new thing for me that I'm starting to see, is if I wake up anxious, then the next thing that happens is I start worrying about something. I don't even know what I'm worrying about. And then from that, I can do multiple things, which could be self-medicate. It could be rude to my kids, whatever. And I think the more you can see the things, take inventory of what's going on in your life, then you're going to start to realize that. One of the things I want to distinguish, though, is everybody has anxiety that in some way or another. It does not mean that you have an anxiety problem if you're anxious every now and then. I want to clarify that, because I think people think, oh man, I was anxious about having to go do this thing. Well, that doesn't mean that you're actually like you have a generalized anxiety disorder. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And that's huge to this, because you need to know the difference. If it's something that's happening continually on a rhythm and in a season, I would say absolutely this is what you need to recognize. From that, I'm telling you, I can't reiterate enough how important it is to start processing things that you think about yourself, things that you believe about yourself, and then ask for help, whether, like you're saying, whether that counseling comes from a best friend or that counseling comes from someone who can dissect it. I believe in using counselors who are unbiased to your situation. So your best friend's going to tell you what you want to know most of the time, where a counselor is going to come in and they don't know your wife, they don't know your employer, and they're going to try to help you be practical in processing what you're feeling. I think that's huge, because then you can kind of navigate it. The other piece is, and some people are against this, but I'm a firm believer in medication and using that side of it. It's a health thing. There's chemicals in our brain that are our brains are being rewired to how the chemicals are being produced, and because of that, anxiety and depression can happen. And that's usually in the way we're thinking creates new thought patterns, which then can create anxiety. And that's what is a huge, huge thing for us to realize. And it's okay to go to you can just go to your doctor, your primary physician, and say, hey, I've been dealing with these things, and they will kind of walk you through. They'll ask you some questions and they'll walk you through. I'm medicated even to this day, where they help me kind of balance out some of those chemicals that are in balance in my head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always talk about, when someone talks about medication and things, it gives your body the ability to continue to do what God's made it to do.
Right.
Because of our brokenness and because of the way we've grown up and the things that we've found ourselves into physically, spiritually, emotionally, that sometimes our body needs a bit more of something to allow it to continue to do what God's asked it to do. I mean, we can watch the body stitch itself back together, but we still go to a doctor to have a broken bone fixed, and then allow our body to continue to fix it. So no, yes. I don't think we need to demonize any sort of medication when it comes to finding a healthy mental place to be in. Aaron, one of the things I saw with coaching churches and being in pastors' offices on a weekly basis, which that was admittedly cut back dramatically over COVID, but it's allowed us to be able to go online. It's allowed us to be able to have things like this podcast, to be able to speak into the lives of pastors. But sitting in pastors' offices, or even sitting on Zoom or in a social distance manner, I've noticed that COVID has really done a number on the mental health of pastors across the nation. It's, when we went to school, and most seminaries train pastors on how to be just that, a pastor, how to love someone through crisis, how to help a family heal through trauma, how to do weddings, how to do funerals, and just a shepherd and pastor through. And COVID stripped all of our pastors of that ability.
Yeah,
it took it away. Even you were taken off the stage for weeks and months. Right. And you weren't able to pastor your people in a way that God's called you to do. And so we're seeing that in in our in our pastors and on our church staff, that it's just really wrecking our church staff, even to the point where pastors are getting out of being getting out of the pastorate. They're quitting the church because of it. Speak to pastors if we understand that, like you've just said earlier in the podcast, that a lot of our people see us as pastors on a pedestal, that we are viewed as someone to model spiritual life after, right? That there is this desire that they are a spiritual leader, and that we are to follow in some of those footsteps. When a pastor comes face to face with these anxieties, with these negative mental thoughts, with the emotional and mental health crisis that they found them in because of COVID, where's the safe place for them to go? We've talked about safety, right? We've talked about that sometimes it doesn't feel safe. Where's the safe place for those men and women to go?
That's a hard one, because I can tell you where it should be.
Right.
You should never have to leave your church to do that. We as pastors and elders and leaders of our church need to be loving on our staff in that way. So I would hope that that's the first place you can go. Now, that may not be your situation, that you may not be in an environment where you feel like you can actually talk about this with someone. I think the first place you should go is find someone you trust. I know it's a simple, easy thing, but as always, the more we can speak this stuff out loud, the more we're bringing it from dark to light. And I think that could be your dad, it could be your best friend, it could be your accountability partner, it could be a counselor. I think the most important thing you can do is stop believing the lie that you have to do it alone.
Preach it.
And that you have to white knuckle your way through it.
Right.
The reality is God created us for community, and the community is the first place you should go.
Right.
I hope it's your church and your leadership of your church, but if it isn't, then there is someone close to you that is willing to walk with you through it.
Yeah. Pastor, we hear this. We know that it is a threat for you to walk into your elders meetings and say, I think I'm going to need some time off because I'm mentally not in a good place. We know that's a scary, scary conversation to have. We hope that you have elders that will love you, pray for you, and to help you find a more healthy place when it comes to your emotional level and your mental state. And so we know the struggles of that. We understand that the things that we're saying for you to do may not be easy, but it's the ideal way for you to become healthier with your mental health. So, Aaron, I really appreciate you taking the time to come over here on the Seats to Streets podcast to be able to speak into the lives of some of these pastors. If someone wanted to follow you and what you're doing to speak into this realm of mental health, how can they follow you or connect with you?
Yeah, so you can find my podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all those places. It's Let's Get Tryin with Aaron Lee. Tryin is not it's a slang term, so
we're
not
from Kentucky, right? Yeah,
I'm actually from Virginia, but
you're from Virginia.
Yeah. I've lived most of my life in Kentucky now. Anyway, so Let's Get Tryin with Aaron Lee. You can also find my website at aarontlee.com, and I'm on Instagram and Facebook and all that jazz.
Yeah. So if you're listening to this and you realize your next step is to open your mouth and to talk to someone, and you possibly don't feel comfortable going to your leadership, then get a hold of us. Get a hold of one of us. You've just heard Aaron's communication and contact information. I'm going to put the Seats to Streets contact information down in the show notes so that you can be able to reach out. And it's no matter when you hear this. We're recording this at the end of April in 2021. If you flip this on and it's 2024 and you realize, I can't go to any of my other pastoral staff with this news, then reach out to us. We would love to help you process through this. Now, we're also going to help you walk through the process of talking to your leadership about it, because that's the healthiest and the ideal way, because we want you to come to a healthier place for you spiritually, physically, and mentally. We don't want to just gloss over that fact. And so if you're here and you're listening and you want to reach out, feel free to do so. We'd love to connect with you. You can reach out directly to me at seatstostreets.com, or you can send me an email at jr@seatstostreets.com, and we would love to be able to connect you. I'd even love to connect you to Aaron's podcast and the Let's Get Tryin crew. Reach out if you want to be connected with that. We'd love to be able to see you become better equipped to move your people from Sunday morning seats to local and global streets. So Aaron, that's all I've got for today's podcast. You got any parting wisdom or parting encouragement you want to give to some of the listeners today?
Hey, don't be afraid to be vulnerable. The reality is God has made us to be in community with one another. I can't reiterate that enough. And don't be afraid. There are people who love you. You're not alone. And that's all I got to say.
Awesome. Well, that's all we got for this episode, folks. We will see you next week on the Seats to Streets podcast. Take care.
All right. I hope that episode and that conversation was encouraging to you. You have to go to seatstostreets.com and check out my buddy JR's podcast. Some great stuff, especially if you're a church leader. This is a great podcast for you, and you can check that out over there on Seats to Streets. He's also out on Apple Podcasts and all the other places as well. So with all that being said, I need to just remind you guys that we have a website, aarontlee.com. You can find the podcast pieces over there. There's show notes. There's additional content. There's some swag that you can pick up that helps support the podcast. Either way, just really appreciate you jumping over and checking that out. Also, we have a newsletter that you can sign up for on the website. Would love to just share content with you on a everyday basis. Also, if you wouldn't mind, I've been asking for this a couple of weeks now, but I've been pleading that if there's some people out there who want to help make this podcast better, shoot me an email at aaron@aarontlee.com. And that's a way I can get to know you a little better. And then I'm just looking for people to help me improve the podcast, to make it better, to make it more relatable, to connect with people on an everyday basis. So be sure to consider doing that. And as always, you know what we're going to do. We're going to live real. We're going to be authentic. So let's get trying.